Buckingham Palace promised the world a brilliant new era of modern transparency. Yet the darkest, most terrifying secrets of Meghan Markle's brief royal reign remain permanently sealed in a vault to prevent the total destruction of a carefully curated, highly lucrative Hollywood image. It is a pleasure to welcome you back, my friends, to a conversation that the powers that be would much rather we did not have. You see, if we rewind the clock to the dizzying heights of the spring of 2018, the global narrative was one of absolute, intoxicating triumph, featuring a glittering spectacle at St. George's Chapel that seemingly cemented the British monarchy's place in the modern age. The public, understandably swept up in the romance of a transatlantic love story, saw only the radiant smiles, the bespoke Givenchy silk, and the promise of a modernized institution ready to embrace change. However, as is so often the case with this particular family, the dazzling public performance was completely at odds with the rapidly deteriorating reality taking place just out of the camera's frame. Behind the heavy, ornate doors of the royal estates, a profoundly different, much darker story was quietly unfolding, one measured not in column inches of praise, but in the hushed, terrified whispers of the people tasked with making the fairy tale a reality. Before we continue, take a second to subscribe. These videos don't always get recommended, and this way you won't miss the next one. To truly comprehend the gravity of what transpired, one must first understand the unique, suffocating ecosystem of Kensington Palace, a place where centuries of unyielding tradition suddenly collided with the jarring demands of celebrity entitlement. For the dedicated individuals who choose a life of royal service, the work is not merely a job, it is an absolute vocation, governed by a rigid code of absolute discretion, profound loyalty, and a stoic acceptance of immense pressure. They are accustomed to the eccentricities of high office, the demanding schedules of working royals, and the sheer weight of historical expectation that permeates every grand corridor and manicured courtyard. Yet, the arrival of the new Duchess of Sussex introduced an entirely foreign, highly aggressive corporate culture that fundamentally shocked the delicate, deeply entrenched sensibilities of the palace machinery. The historic walls, accustomed to the quiet hum of polite efficiency and deferential nods, suddenly became an echoing chamber for a relentless, demanding energy that simply did not comprehend the word no or the concept of institutional boundaries. It was as if a slick, ruthless Los Angeles talent agency had forcefully set up shop within the hallowed halls of a centuries-old institution, creating a toxic friction that would soon ignite into a full-blown crisis. The honeymoon period, that brief golden window where minor transgressions are forgiven in the name of adjustment, evaporated with a terrifying suddenness, replaced by an atmosphere of palpable, paralyzing dread. For the young women working intimately within the Sussex household, the daily commute into the palace transformed from a badge of profound honor into an agonizing exercise in psychological endurance. Imagine, if you will, the sheer visceral terror of sitting at a mahogany desk, listening to the sharp, rapid click of heels approaching down the corridor, knowing with absolute certainty that the next few minutes could dismantle your professional confidence and your emotional well-being. The air in those private offices grew incredibly thick with a suffocating paranoid tension where every drafted email, every arranged schedule, and every innocent interaction was subjected to a brutal, unforgiving scrutiny. The staff, brilliant and dedicated professionals who had previously thrived under the immense pressure of royal duties, found themselves reduced to a state of constant, trembling anxiety, walking on proverbial eggshells to avoid triggering another unpredictable, devastating outburst. This was not the standard expected stress of organizing state dinners or royal tours. This was an acute, personalized psychological warfare that left highly capable women weeping silently in the palace washrooms, desperately trying to compose themselves before facing the onslaught once more. It was precisely this climate of unendurable misery that forced the hand of Jason Knauf, the Sussex's communications secretary at the time and a man thoroughly accustomed to navigating the treacherous waters of high-level public relations. Knauf was no fragile newcomer. He was a seasoned, highly capable operator who had seen his fair share of crisis and ego. Yet, even he found the unfolding situation morally reprehensible and utterly unsustainable. One can only imagine the profound internal agony he experienced on that fateful October day in 2018, sitting alone in his office, staring intently at the glowing screen of his computer as he weighed the catastrophic consequences of the action he was about to take. He was acutely aware that formally accusing a newly minted, globally adored royal bride of extreme workplace cruelty was tantamount to throwing a hand grenade directly into the very heart of the monarchy. Yet, as he watched excellent, dedicated staff members being systematically broken down and driven to the brink of total collapse, his sense of basic human decency compelled him to cross the Rubicon and document the nightmare. It was a singular moment of incredible professional courage, a solitary bureaucrat deciding that the institutional instinct to protect the principal at all costs could no longer justify the human wreckage accumulating just outside his door. The resulting email, deliberately sent to Prince William's then private secretary Simon Case, was a masterpiece of cold, hard, devastating clarity that stripped away the Hollywood glamour to reveal the ugly truth beneath. Knauf did not mince his words or attempt to soften the blow with diplomatic royal jargon. He explicitly stated his grave concern that the Duchess had successfully driven two personal assistants completely out of the household and was actively undermining the confidence of a third. He painted a grim, undeniable picture of an environment where totally unacceptable behavior was not just tolerated, but weaponized, detailing how the Duchess seemed permanently intent on having someone firmly in her sights. Reading those words, one can almost feel the crushing weight of the responsibility Knauf felt to protect his team, practically begging the senior palace hierarchy to intervene before the household completely collapsed under the strain. He brilliantly, yet tragically, noted that he remained deeply concerned that absolutely nothing would be done to protect these young women from the relentless barrage of criticism and emotional manipulation they were enduring daily. The email was effectively a desperate distress signal launched from a sinking ship, formalizing the horrifying whispers and forcing the ancient institution to finally look at the monster that was tearing through its own drawing rooms. The immediate aftermath of this explosive document landing in the upper echelons of the palace hierarchy was not swift, decisive action, but rather a profound, terrified paralysis that allowed the toxicity to metastasize further into the foundation of the household. A well-placed source recalled the unprecedented, chilling tension that permanently settled over the Sussex's staff during this dark period, a time when the victims realized that their cries for help were being swallowed by the bureaucratic void. The absolute horror of the situation was compounded by the fact that the alleged perpetrator was heavily protected by the impenetrable armor of royal status, leaving the staff utterly defenseless against the relentless, demanding onslaught. The institution, inherently designed to protect the immediate family above all earthly considerations, found itself completely paralyzed, unsure of how to discipline a star who believed she had single-handedly modernized the monarchy and was entirely above reproach. Consequently, the brave aides who had dared to speak up were left completely exposed, trapped in a gilded cage with their tormentor, watching their dream careers disintegrate while the rest of the world naively applauded the progressive new era of the British monarchy. It was a masterclass in institutional cowardice, a deeply cynical sacrifice of loyal servants upon the altar of public relations, setting the stage for a dramatic rupture that would forever alter the history of the House of Windsor. It truly is a testament to the sheer unyielding resilience of the human spirit that a group of highly trained, sophisticated professionals found it necessary to form what they themselves grimly dubbed the Sussex Survivors Club. You must understand that these were not delicate blossoms easily bruised by a brisk word. These were seasoned aides, women who had navigated the shark-infested waters of high-level politics and the intricate, often brutal hierarchy of the British establishment with grace and skill. Yet, within the gilded confines of Kensington Palace, they found themselves facing a brand of psychological attrition that felt less like traditional royal service and more like a desperate tour of duty in a particularly toxic corporate war zone. The sheer irony of it all is almost too much to bear when one considers that while these aides were being systematically dismantled behind closed doors, the Duchess was traversing the global stage, preaching a gospel of compassion, empathy, and the vital importance of mental health. It was a staggering display of cognitive dissonance that left those within the inner circle gasping for air, trapped in a reality where their lived experience was being surgically erased by a relentless, polished public relations machine that demanded absolute adoration while providing nothing but professional coldness in return. One cannot help but feel a profound sense of weary cynicism when examining the daily operational reality of what became known amongst the terrified staff as the Palace of Dread. The atmosphere was not merely tense, it was vibrating with a low-frequency anxiety that manifested in the most visceral of ways, from the sudden sharp intake of breath when a phone vibrated to the frantic, hushed huddles in the tea pantry where staff members would compare notes on the latest perceived transgression. A well-meaning staff member recounted the sheer, exhausting absurdity of the 5 a.m. email barrages, a relentless stream of demands, critiques, and suggestions that arrived before the sun had even touched the Thames, ensuring that the staff began every single day already on the defensive, already failing, already exhausted. There is a specific kind of cruelty in denying a subordinate the peace of the night, a calculated way of asserting dominance that ensures you are never out of their thoughts, acting as a constant looming presence even in their most private moments. It wasn't just about the workload, which was undeniably immense. It was about the deliberate theatrical nature of the demands, the sense that one was perpetually auditioning for a role that could be recast at the slightest whim of a principal who viewed staff not as colleagues, but as disposable props in her own personal drama. The human wreckage left in the wake of this relentless ambition began to manifest in the most public of ways, despite the best efforts of the palace to smooth over the cracks with bland diplomatic statements. Consider the case of Melissa Touabti, a highly respected, exceptionally capable French professional who had previously assisted some of the most demanding figures in the global fashion industry. She arrived at the palace with a stellar reputation and a backbone of steel, yet within 6 months, she was gone, reportedly driven to tears and total professional disillusionment by the impossible standards and the shifting emotional sands of her principal. A source within the inner circle whispered of the utter shock that rippled through the royal households when Touabti walked away. It was a definitive signal that something was profoundly, perhaps irreparably, wrong within the Sussex camp. For a professional of her caliber to quit such a prestigious post so abruptly, sacrificing a career highlight that most would give their right arm for, spoke volumes more than any polished press release ever could. It was a silent, devastating scream of enough. But the departures didn't stop there, and each one added a new layer of grim reality to the Sussex survivors narrative, painting a picture of a household in a state of permanent, frantic turnover. Amy Pickerill, another bright star in the royal firmament who had been handpicked to mentor the new Duchess and guide her through the labyrinthine intricacies of British life, also found herself heading for the exit far sooner than anyone expected. Imagine the internal monologue of a woman like Pickerill, someone who had invested her time, her expertise, and her genuine goodwill into making this transition a success, only to find that her advice was not only ignored, but frequently treated as a personal affront. The pressure of trying to bridge the gap between a centuries-old institution and a woman who viewed tradition as a personal shackle must have been utterly soul-crushing, a thankless task that rewarded loyalty with suspicion and hard work with a cold, dismissive shoulder. The long-term consequences for these women are profound. They didn't just lose their jobs, they lost their sense of professional security, often finding their reputations quietly questioned by those who found it easier to blame the help than to look closely at the behavior of the woman at the top. The emergence of the Duchess difficult moniker in the tabloid press was not, as the Sussex camp would later claim, a coordinated racist smear campaign orchestrated by a shadowy cabal of journalists, but rather a reflection of the genuine, widespread exasperation felt by those who actually had to interact with her. It was a nickname born of lived experience, a shorthand for the theatrical sighs, the dramatic eye rolls, and the way the temperature in a room would plummet the moment she entered it if things were not exactly to her liking. A source behind closed doors described the atmosphere as one of permanent high alert, where everyone from the most senior advisors to the junior footmen felt they were one wrong, flat white away from a devastating confrontation. The sheer narcissism required to believe that your personal whims should override the established protocols of a sovereign state is truly something to behold, and it created a friction that rubbed the skin of the monarchy raw. There was a profound, wearying cynicism in the way the Sussexes would later frame these very real workplace grievances as bullying against them, turning the victims into the aggressors in a perverse reversal of reality that left the actual survivors reeling in disbelief. As we look back on this period, the true tragedy lies in the systematic silencing of these voices, the way their trauma was tucked away into the dark corners of the royal archives to preserve a fragile peace. These women were not just employees, they were the backbone of the daily operations of the crown, yet they were treated as collateral damage in a desperate attempt to keep the peace with a couple who seemed intent on burning every bridge they crossed. The long-term psychological scars remain, the sudden anxiety at a ringing phone, the lingering doubt about one's own professional worth, and the bitter knowledge that your truth was traded for the sake of an institution's public image. It is a grim reminder that in the world of high-stakes royalty, the truth is often the first thing to be buried, covered over with layers of silk and hollow promises, while those who suffered the most are left to pick up the pieces of their shattered confidence in the shadows. We are left to wonder how many more voices were stifled, how many more tears were shed in the silence of the palace corridors, and why, in an age of supposed accountability, the Sussex survivors are still waiting for their day in the sun. If we are to truly understand the sheer agonizing depth of the dysfunction within the Sussex household, we must look toward the woman that the palace insiders once referred to, with a mixture of awe and trepidation, as the Panther. Samantha Cohen was no mere administrative functionary. She was a titan of the old guard, a formidable Australian who had spent 17 years at the very right hand of the late Queen Elizabeth II. She was the embodiment of the stoic, iron-willed professionalism that defines the British monarchy at its most effective. A woman who understood the unspoken rhythms of the court better than she understood her own heartbeat. When the late Queen personally asked her to step out of her planned departure and stay on to guide the newly minted Duchess of Sussex, it was intended to be the ultimate gift, a steadying, experienced hand to navigate the treacherous cultural waters of the United Kingdom. Yet, for Cohen, what should have been a final, graceful chapter in a distinguished career rapidly curdled into a relentless, soul-crushing exercise in managing the unmanageable, proving that even the most seasoned veteran can be broken by an environment devoid of mutual respect. One can only imagine the profound, silent endurance Cohen must have exercised as she watched the centuries-old protocols she revered being treated with such casual, Hollywood-style disdain. A source within the inner circle whispered that Cohen, a woman who had successfully managed the complexities of the Commonwealth, found herself utterly bewildered by the frantic, often nonsensical demands emanating from the Sussexes' private quarters. There is a specific, quiet agony for a professional of her caliber when they realize that their expertise is not viewed as a resource to be utilized, but as a barrier to be dismantled by an arriviste who confuses celebrity whims with sovereign duty. The internal monologue of a woman like Cohen during those months must have been one of weary, mounting disbelief as she attempted to reconcile the Duchess's public posture of kindness with the sharp clinical way she allegedly treated the very people working to protect her. It was a clash of cultures so violent and so fundamental that it left the Panther herself feeling like a cornered animal, presiding over a household that felt less like a royal office and more like a high-stakes, low-trust startup where loyalty was a one-way street ending in a brick wall. The sheer difficulty of the situation was perhaps most tellingly revealed when the time finally came for Cohen to depart. and the palace machinery ground to a terrifying, screeching halt. In what can only be described as a staggering indictment of the working conditions, the hierarchy found it virtually impossible to find a successor willing to take up the mantle. The role of private secretary to the Sussexes had become the ultimate poison chalice within the royal ecosystem. We have heard through a source within the inner circle that candidates who would normally have fought tooth and nail for such a prestigious appointment were quietly, yet firmly, declining to even be interviewed, having heard the whispered warnings of the Sussex survivors. The atmosphere around the recruitment process was one of toxic notoriety, as if the vacancy were not for a royal aide, but for a sacrificial lamb destined to be devoured by the relentless demands of a principal who refused to acknowledge the human cost of her ambition. This revolving door of talent was not a coincidence or a string of bad luck. It was a systemic failure of leadership that left the household looking shambolic and the monarchy's HR department in a state of permanent panicked crisis management. It was only recently, years after she finally escaped the Sussex orbit, that Samantha Cohen herself broke her characteristic, dignified silence to confirm what many of us had long suspected regarding the internal investigation. She admitted, in her trademarked measured tone, that she was indeed one of the 10 primary individuals interviewed during the bullying probe, an admission that carries the weight of a leaden anchor in the sea of Sussex denials. One must consider the long-term consequences of such a high-ranking, unimpeachable figure being forced to testify against a member of the family she had served so loyally for nearly 2 decades. For Cohen, the act of giving that testimony was likely not born of a desire for revenge, but of a deep-seated professional obligation to ensure that the truth of what she witnessed and what she endured was at least recorded, even if the palace chose to bury it beneath a mountain of bureaucratic red tape. Her involvement elevates the allegations from mere tabloid gossip to a formal documented grievance from the very top of the royal food chain, making the palace's subsequent decision to hide the report feel all the more like a cynical betrayal of the very people who kept the institution running. The pressure surrounding Cohen's tenure was not merely about the workload, but about the existential threat the Sussex's management style posed to the very fabric of the palace's relationship with its staff. A source within the inner circle has suggested that the Panther found herself constantly acting as a human shield, attempting to absorb the Duchess's more volatile impulses before they could shatter the morale of the junior aides. It is a thankless, exhausting role that leaves a person hollowed out, a guardian of a flame that seems determined to burn the house down from the inside. The long-term consequences for the monarchy are stark. They lost one of their most capable, loyal assets in Cohen, and in doing so, they signaled to the entire staff that their well-being would always be secondary to the convenience of a high-profile royal, no matter how disruptive that royal might be. It created a legacy of quiet resentment that still simmers beneath the surface of the royal households today, a reminder that the cost of modernizing the monarchy, in this particular instance, was the dignity and the careers of those who knew it best. Ultimately, the Samantha Cohen enigma serves as the ultimate proof that the friction within the Sussex household was not a matter of misunderstanding or cultural differences, but a fundamental failure of character at the very top. When a woman who has served the sovereign with distinction for 17 years is reduced to being a survivor, the narrative of the misunderstood Duchess begins to disintegrate under the cold, hard light of reality. We are left looking at a landscape of professional wreckage where the victims are expected to remain silent while the perpetrators continue to monetize their grievances on a global scale. It is a cynical, deeply unsatisfying state of affairs that leaves a bitter taste in the mouth of anyone who values the principles of fairness and accountability. As we move forward, we must ask ourselves how much longer these voices can be suppressed, and what it says about our modern world that we allow the polished veneer of celebrity to obscure the raw, unvarnished suffering of the people standing just behind the velvet rope. The story of the Panther and her time in the Sussex cage is a cautionary tale of what happens when tradition is met with a lack of basic human decency. It highlights the immense invisible pressure that is placed upon those who serve the crown and the devastating impact when that service is met with hostility instead of gratitude. Cohen's quiet confirmation of her role in the investigation is a crack in the dam, a sign that the truth, no matter how deeply buried, has a way of seeping through the gaps in the palace's defenses. And as we continue to peel back the layers of this extraordinary cover-up, we must never forget the human faces behind the titles, the people who were simply trying to do their jobs in an environment that had become a psychological battlefield. It is their story, more than any glossy Netflix documentary or ghost-written memoir, that tells us the true history of the Sussexes' brief, turbulent time at the heart of the British monarchy. As we sit here today, the silence from the palace regarding the specifics of Cohen's testimony remains deafening, a tactical omission that speaks volumes about the contents of that buried report. It is a silence that protects the Sussexes, yes, but it also protects the institution from having to admit how badly it failed its own people. This culture of secrecy is the very thing that allowed the toxicity to flourish in the first place, creating a vacuum where rumors and half-truths can grow into legends. But for those who were there, for those who lived through the era of the Sussex survivors, the truth is not a rumor. It is a memory of tears in the hallway, of 5 a.m. panic attacks, and of a professional world turned upside down by the whims of a woman who mistook power for the right to be cruel. And that, my friends, is a secret that no amount of royal vault-locking can ever truly erase from the history of the House of Windsor. The year 2021 will be remembered in the annals of royal history as the moment the simmering Cold War between California and London finally escalated into a scorched-earth tactical conflict. Just days before, the world was set to watch the Sussexes deliver their carefully rehearsed high-octane grievances to Oprah Winfrey. A devastating broadside was launched from across the Atlantic that threatened to sink their narrative before it even left the harbor. The leak to the Times of London detailing Jason Knauf's 2018 bullying complaint hit the Montecito mansion like a physical blow, shattering the serene, curated image of the persecuted humanitarian that Meghan Markle had spent millions to construct. Imagine the sheer, unadulterated fury radiating through that California estate as the news broke. The air must have been thick with the frantic energy of a legal team in full combat mode, desperately trying to neutralize a truth that had been dormant for 3 years. It was no longer a disagreement over royal protocol. It was a transatlantic war of narratives, a brutal chess match where the casualties were not just reputations, but the very integrity of the institution itself. A source behind closed doors described the atmosphere in Montecito as one of absolute white-hot indignation, with the Sussex camp immediately characterizing the leak as a calculated smear campaign designed to silence them. The internal monologue of a woman who had spent her career meticulously managing her public image must have been a chaotic storm of defensive rationalization and strategic panic as she watched her past catch up to her in the most public way possible. From their perspective, the timing was too perfect to be anything other than a weaponized hit piece, a cruel attempt by the men in gray suits to discredit her just as she was about to unburden her soul to the American public. There was a profound, almost Shakespearean irony in the way they reacted, by painting themselves as the ultimate victims of the very bullying they were accused of perpetrating against their own staff. This defensive posture wasn't just a PR strategy. It was a psychological shield, a way to avoid the crushing weight of accountability by reframing every legitimate workplace grievance as a racist institutional conspiracy. Meanwhile, back in the gray, rain-slicked corridors of London, the atmosphere was one of a far more clinical, cynical satisfaction. A well-placed source noted that while the official palace response was one of grave concern, there was a sense among the long-suffering aides that the cosmic scales were finally beginning to balance. The senior palace hierarchy, usually so allergic to public confrontation, took the unprecedented step of announcing an official HR investigation into the claims, a move that sent a clear, chilling message. The protection of the principal was no longer the primary objective. For the officials at Buckingham Palace, the decision to launch this probe was a tactical masterpiece, effectively creating a formal dossier of truth that could be held in reserve while the Sussexes played their hand on global television. It was the institutional equivalent of a cold stare across a poker table, a reminder that while the Sussexes had the cameras, the firm still held the files. The legal threats flying back and forth across the ocean during those few days in March created a pressure cooker environment that left both camps utterly exhausted and permanently embittered. Meghan's lawyers were firing off missives accusing the palace of peddling a wholly false narrative, a phrase dripping with the kind of litigious aggression that is rarely seen in royal circles. One can almost see the frantic late-night strategy meetings in Montecito, the blue light of laptop screens illuminating faces taut with the stress of maintaining a facade that was beginning to crack under the strain of historical reality. The long-term consequences of this specific explosion cannot be overstated. It wasn't just a temporary PR skirmish, but the permanent destruction of trust. Any lingering hope of a soft landing for the Sussexes within the family was vaporized in the heat of that March week, replaced by a permanent, deep-seated resentment that would define their relationship with the monarchy for years to come. As the world sat down to watch the Oprah interview, a massive global audience was now viewing Meghan not just as a royal rebel, but as a figure accused of the very cruelty she was decrying. The padding method reveals the hidden psychological cost of this duality. For the Duchess, every word spoken to Oprah about her suffering had to be weighed against the knowledge that there were women in London who had wept because of her. The surrounding atmosphere was one of a total breakdown in communication, where the truth had become a subjective tool to be wielded in a fight for survival. This was the moment the Sussex survivors were officially acknowledged by the institution, however reluctantly, and the resulting fallout ensured that the bullying allegations would remain a ghost in the room for every future project the couple would undertake. It was a masterclass in the ugly, unvarnished reality of high-stakes celebrity, where the pursuit of a truth is often just a polite way of describing an all-out war for total narrative control. The institutional wheels of the British monarchy have always turned with a slow, grinding deliberateness. Yet the moment the palace officially announced it was launching a formal HR investigation into the bullying allegations, the sound was less like a clock and more like a heavy iron gate slamming shut. You must understand that for an institution that prides itself on never complaining and never explaining, this was a total capitulation to the modern world of corporate accountability, a move that left the old guard at Buckingham Palace feeling a profound sense of institutional vertigo. The announcement itself was cloaked in the sterile clinical language of human resources, expressing grave concern over the reports in the Times. But beneath that dry veneer was a calculated high-stakes gamble to regain control of a narrative that was spiraling toward total catastrophe. This was not merely about checking boxes or satisfying a news cycle. It was the birth of a formal dossier of truth that the palace realized it desperately needed to protect the very foundations of the crown from the Sussexes' transatlantic broadsides. The surrounding atmosphere in the royal offices during those initial weeks was one of grim, focused intensity. As the realization dawned on everyone involved that the family laundry was no longer being washed in private, it was being scrutinized by a team of high-priced independent solicitors. The decision to bring in an external third-party law firm to conduct the investigation was perhaps the most cynical and strategically brilliant move of all, shifting the burden of proof away from the emotional realm and into the cold, hard light of legal testimony. One can only imagine the internal monologue of the senior courtiers, perhaps even King Charles or Prince William, as they weighed the risks of allowing outsiders into the most private corners of their professional lives. There must have been a deep gnawing anxiety about what else might be unearthed in such a thorough scrubbing, yet the necessity of having an independent stamp on the findings overrode the traditional instinct for total internal secrecy. For the Sussex survivors, the news was met with a complex mixture of profound relief and an almost paralyzing anxiety, as they were suddenly asked to step out of the shadows and formalize their trauma for the record. The pressure on these women was immense. They were not just giving a statement to a colleague over tea, they were sitting across from sharp clinical interrogators who were trained to poke holes in every narrative and verify every claim with the precision of a surgeon. The actual process of gathering these testimonies took place within a landscape of immense psychological strain, far removed from the glittering ballrooms and garden parties the public associates with royal life. Imagine a sterile, windowless conference room in a high-end London legal suite where the air's heavy with the scent of expensive stationery and stale coffee, and the only sound is the rhythmic scratching of a pen or the soft hum of a digital recorder. For the aides who had been driven to tears or had watched their professional confidence be systematically dismantled by the Duchess's management style, reliving these moments was a grueling exercise in professional self-exposure. A source within the inner circle described the visceral fear many of these women felt, wondering if their names would eventually leak or if the Sussexes' formidable legal team in California would find a way to retaliate against them for speaking their truth. Every interview was a high-wire act, a delicate balance of wanting to ensure justice was done while fearing the long-term consequences of becoming a permanent enemy of a prince of the realm and his Hollywood-powered wife. Meanwhile, across the pond in the sun-drenched enclave of Montecito, the reaction to the investigation's launch was predictably dismissive and steeped in a brand of weary performative persecution. For the Duchess, the investigation was not a search for truth, but a weaponized hit job, a cynical attempt by the institution to discredit her lived experience just as she was gaining traction with the American public. A source behind closed doors described the atmosphere in the Sussex household as one of frantic defensive maneuvering, where every new development in the London probe was dissected by a phalanx of US-based PR consultants and lawyers. The internal monologue of the California duo was likely one of absolute conviction that they were the victims of a coordinated smear campaign, a narrative that allowed them to ignore the very real human cost of their actions while focusing entirely on their own perceived suffering. This refusal to engage with the substance of the claims only served to deepen the divide, turning what should have been a standard workplace inquiry into a proxy war for the soul of the modern monarchy. The pressure on the firm to keep this investigation on track while simultaneously managing the fallout from the Oprah interview was staggering, creating a climate of total unremitting crisis management. Someone close to palace circles explained that the legal parameters were set with a rigid, almost obsessive focus on protecting the institution's future liability, ensuring that whatever was found would be documented with total accuracy but kept under the tightest possible security. There was a profound, unspoken fear that if the details of the Sussex Survivors Club were ever fully released, the public outcry would be so great that it would force a permanent, ugly break with the king's second son that the monarchy was not yet ready to navigate. This was the unexploded bomb in the room, a dossier that contained enough explosive material to level the Sussexes' humanitarian brand, yet one that the palace hierarchy was increasingly hesitant to actually detonate for fear of the collateral damage to the royal brand as a whole. The long-term consequences of this period were becoming clear even as the first testimonies were being transcribed. The relationship between the royal family and its professional staff had been altered forever. The unspoken contract of service, where aides tolerated the eccentricities of the royals in exchange for the prestige and protection of the institution, had been shattered by the Sussexes' perceived abuses and the palace's initial failure to intervene. This investigation was an attempt to mend that contract, to show the staff that there were, in fact, lines that even a duchess could not cross without consequence, yet the very fact that it was necessary signaled a profound loss of institutional innocence. As the legal teams continued their work throughout 2021, the shadow of the investigation hung over every public appearance the Sussexes made, a silent documented rebuttal to their claims of being the kind and compassionate royals they portrayed themselves to be. It was the beginning of the end for the Sussexes' royal-adjacent credibility, a slow-motion car crash of a reputation that was being meticulously recorded by a team of lawyers who were not interested in fairy tales, but in the cold, unvarnished facts of a very modern workplace nightmare. The sheer volume of evidence gathered, including the testimonies of heavyweights like Samantha Cohen and the digital trail of those infamous 5 a.m. emails, created a weight of evidence that was impossible to ignore. Yet even as the investigation drew to a close, the palace was already beginning to retreat into its shell of secrecy. The surrounding pressure from the public and the press to release the findings was immense, yet the internal pressure to protect the sanctity of the family was greater, leading to a tension that would eventually result in the report being buried in the royal vault forever. This was the ultimate cynicism of the firm, using the pain of the survivors to build a defensive wall, then refusing to give those survivors the public vindication they had risked everything to obtain. For the women who had sat in those sterile rooms and bared their souls to the solicitors, the long-term consequence was a feeling of being used twice, once by the Duchess who allegedly bullied them, and once by the institution that promised them justice only to trade it for a quiet life. The investigation had, indeed, borne a truth, but it was a truth that the palace decided was too dangerous for the world to see, ensuring that the ghosts of Kensington Palace would continue to haunt the halls of history for years to come. The summer of 2022 brought a silence that was more deafening than any tabloid headline could ever hope to be, marking the moment when the heavy velvet curtain was finally drawn over the most uncomfortable chapter in modern royal history. After months of legal wrangling and the quiet, high-stakes gathering of testimonies from those who had endured the Sussexes' tumultuous reign, the great British public, and indeed the world, expected a moment of reckoning, a definitive document that would finally settle the score. Instead, what we received was a masterclass in institutional obfuscation, a polite but firm closing of the ledgers that signaled the investigation was complete, yet the findings would remain under lock and key for all eternity. It was a move that felt less like a quest for justice and more like a tactical retreat into the shadows, a decision that essentially told the victims their pain was valuable only insofar as it could be used as a bargaining chip in a much larger, more cynical game of royal chess. One can almost see the senior courtiers breathing a collective sigh of relief as the heavy oak doors of the archive were sealed, effectively burying the Sussex survivors along with the inconvenient truths they had dared to voice. The justification offered by the palace, that of protecting the confidentiality of those who participated, was, on its surface, a noble sentiment, yet it carried the distinct metallic tang of a convenient excuse designed to prevent a total public relations meltdown. Behind the scenes, the internal monologue of the palace legal teams must have been one of sheer unadulterated pragmatism, calculating that the damage caused by the report's release would far outweigh the benefits of total transparency. They knew that if the public were to read the raw, unvarnished accounts of the alleged bullying, it would create an irreversible chasm between the House of Windsor and the Sussexes, potentially turning Harry and Meghan into permanent martyrs, or, conversely, radioactive outcasts. The surrounding pressure from the media was immense, with journalists circling like vultures for a glimpse of the findings, but the institution chose to starve them out, prioritizing the long-term stability of the crown over the immediate emotional needs of a few broken-hearted aides. It was a cold, clinical assessment that prioritized the brand over the people who actually built it, a reminder that in the upper echelons of power, individuals are often just the grease for the gears of history. This decision did not happen in a vacuum, and we must consider the specific, ruthless pragmatism of King Charles as he navigated his final months of preparation for sovereign responsibility regarding this delicate family matter. A longtime family acquaintance has suggested that the king's primary objective was not justice, but the containment of a fire that threatened to consume the royal narrative before a new reign had even properly begun. To Charles, the report was a liability, a toxic asset that served no purpose other than to keep the Sussex drama on the front pages, and his decision to bury it was a clear signal that the modern monarchy would be one of quiet control rather than messy accountability. One can imagine him in his private study, weighing the loyalty of his staff against the survival of the institution, eventually deciding that the silence of the vault was a much safer bet than the roar of the crowd. It was a moment that revealed the true nature of the firm's leadership, a collective that understands that some secrets are simply too expensive to tell, even when the price is paid in the currency of human dignity. For the women who had risked their reputations and their peace of mind to testify against the Duchess, the closing of the vault felt like a second, even more profound betrayal by the very establishment they had spent their lives serving. They had been promised an investigation that would take their claims seriously, yet they watched as their testimonies were transformed into a ghost story, a series of documents that would never see the light of day. The emotional weight of this realization must have been crushing, a cold awakening to the fact that they were merely pawns in a much larger game of transatlantic PR warfare, their trauma useful only as a deterrent against further Sussex aggression. A source behind closed doors whispered of the profound disappointment that rippled through the Survivors Club, a sense that their bravery had been pocketed by the palace and then promptly forgotten in favor of a quiet life. The long-term consequences for these women are a lingering sense of professional invisibility, a feeling that they were used as human shields and then discarded once the immediate threat of the Sussexes' media projects had passed. There is, of course, a darker, more cynical layer to this burial. The report now exists as a permanent, invisible sword of Damocles hanging over the heads of Prince Harry and Meghan Markle in their California mansion. By keeping the findings secret, the palace retains the ultimate nuclear option, a dossier of documented misdeeds that can be leaked or referenced should the Sussexes ever decide to cross a certain line of public hostility. A well-placed source has hinted that this was always the intended outcome, not a public execution of the Duchess's character, but a quiet, effective form of institutional deterrent that ensures a degree of caution in the Montecito camp. The surrounding atmosphere of this armed truce is one of constant, low-level paranoia, where both sides know exactly what is in the vault, but neither side can afford to be the one to open it. It is a masterpiece of Machiavellian maneuvering that perfectly encapsulates the modern monarchy, an institution that deals in the shadows to protect its place in the light, leaving the truth to wither in the darkness of an archive. Ultimately, the decision to hide the bullying report tells us everything we need to know about the current state of the British monarchy and its willingness to sacrifice moral clarity for the sake of survival. It reinforces the idea that the firm is exactly that, a business designed to endure regardless of the human cost or the debris left in its wake. As we look at the polished facade of the royal family today, we must remember that beneath the smiles and the ceremonies lies a locked vault containing the shattered remains of professional lives and the hushed voices of those who were told their truth was too dangerous to be heard. The long-term consequence of this silence is a slow rot of trust within the royal workforce, a knowledge that if you are broken by the machine will simply bury you and keep on turning. It is a grim, cynical reality that serves as the foundation for the next chapter of this ongoing drama. A reminder that in the world of princes and duchesses, the most important stories are often the ones that are never told. The tactical reality of this situation is that while the report remains physically locked within the sovereign's archives, it exists in the minds of the Sussexes as a permanent, unexploded bomb, a dormant threat that dictates the very rhythm of their public lives. One can only imagine the sheer exhausting paranoia that must permeate the air in that sprawling Montecito mansion where the California sunshine cannot quite bleach away the long, dark shadows cast by the files sitting in a London vault. Every time the Duke and Duchess prepare to launch a new tell-all project or a glossy documentary, there must be a frantic, whispered debate behind closed doors about whether this will be the final provocation that forces the palace to accidentally allow a more detailed summary of the findings to find its way into the hands of a sympathetic journalist. It is a state of perpetual check, a psychological weight that ensures their freedom from the monarchy is entirely illusory, tethered as they are to the documented evidence of a past they desperately wish to rewrite. From their perspective, the palace isn't just an institution they escaped. It is a creditor holding a debt of truth that could be called in at any moment to bankrupt their remaining credibility. The surrounding atmosphere of this transatlantic standoff is defined by a staggering, almost comical irony when one looks at the professional wreckage currently accumulating within their American business ventures. We have been told to believe that the move to the United States was a quest for a kinder, more progressive way of working, yet the revolving door of staff at their Archewell Foundation suggests that the toxic climate of Kensington Palace was not a geographical issue, but a portable one. In the few short years since their departure, we have seen a dizzying exodus of high-level executives, chiefs of staff, global press secretaries, and senior advisors who seem to vanish into the Californian fog almost as quickly as they are hired. It creates a narrative of persistent, systemic failure that no amount of soft-focus photography or inspirational quotes can fully obscure, painting a picture of a couple who demand absolute, cult-like loyalty but offer very little in the way of professional stability or basic respect in return. The long-term consequence of this American exodus is the slow, agonizing death of their brand's core premise, the idea that they are the enlightened, compassionate alternative to the stuffy and uncaring British monarchy. A source behind closed doors has provided a chillingly familiar description of the current working conditions within the Sussexes' American inner circle, detailing an environment of high-stress performative activism that leaves aides feeling like disposable assets in a celebrity ego trip. This source suggests that the same patterns identified in the Buried London report, the erratic demands, the blurred lines between personal whims and professional duties, and the soul-crushing critiques, have simply been rebranded for a Hollywood audience. The staff in Montecito reportedly operate under a cloud of constant low-level anxiety, knowing that to disagree with the Duchess is to risk being branded as not a team player, or, worse, an active saboteur of their global mission. It is a fascinating, if deeply cynical, study in human behavior to watch a couple preach about building a better world while allegedly leaving a trail of professional burnout and shattered confidence in their own private office. The pressure on these American aides is perhaps even greater than it was for the palace staff, as they lack the institutional protections of the civil service and are often bound by draconian non-disclosure agreements that keep their true experiences buried under the threat of ruinous litigation. The psychological toll on the Sussexes' own PR teams must be reaching a breaking point, as they are tasked with the impossible job of spinning compassion while simultaneously firefighting the persistent rumors of workplace toxicity that follow the couple like a bad smell. Imagine the internal monologue of a high-priced Hollywood publicist staring at yet another resignation letter from a senior aide, trying to craft a statement that makes it look like a planned transition rather than a desperate flight to safety. They are essentially being asked to sell a product that is fundamentally broken, a kindness brand that is increasingly viewed by the public as a cynical, hollow facade designed to mask a far more unpleasant reality. The surrounding pressure from a skeptical media and an increasingly weary public means that every new hire is scrutinized and every departure is treated as a confirmation of the buried bullying allegations. This constant state of damage control is unsustainable, and it leaves the Sussexes in a vulnerable, isolated position where they are surrounded only by those too new to know the truth or too well paid to speak it. As we look at the broader implications, it becomes clear that the Buried report acts as a silent witness to every impact statement the Sussexes release, a documented rebuttal to their claims of moral superiority. The long-term consequence of this duality, the public saint versus the private boss, is the total erosion of their ability to influence the global conversation in any meaningful, lasting way. People are not blind, and they certainly are not stupid. They see the disconnect between the speeches on mental health and the reports of staff weeping in the corridors, whether those corridors are in London or Santa Barbara. The Sussexes have essentially trapped themselves in a cage of their own making, where their greatest enemy is not the British press or the men in gray suits, but the very real testimonies of the people who have worked for them. The unexploded bomb in the royal vault doesn't even need to be detonated to do its damage. The mere knowledge of its existence is enough to poison the well of their public reputation forever. In the final analysis, The Californian facade is beginning to show cracks that no amount of expensive PR filler can bridge, revealing a reality that is far more mundane and far more unpleasant than the fairy tale they sold to the world. We are witnessing the slow public unraveling of a narrative, a process where the truth is gradually catching up to the carefully managed image, and the results are not particularly pretty. The irony of the Sussexes' situation is profound. In their desperate attempt to control their own story, they have become the most scrutinized and perhaps the most distrusted figures in the modern cultural landscape. They are a couple who wanted to be world leaders of thought and empathy, but who are increasingly remembered as a cautionary tale about the dangers of believing your own press releases. As the Sussex survivors in America continue to grow in number, the silence from the vault in London becomes even more significant, a reminder that while you can run from your past, you can never quite outrun the documented evidence of who you truly are when the cameras are turned off. We find ourselves then at the end of a very long and sordid paper trail, staring at the heavy reinforced door of a royal archive that houses a truth too volatile for public consumption. It is a profoundly cynical conclusion to a saga that began with such manufactured hope, a testament to the fact that in the high-stakes theater of the British monarchy, the preservation of the institution will always, without exception, take precedence over the validation of the individual. King Charles, navigating the early years of his reign with a pragmatism that would make his ancestors proud, has made the calculated decision that the peace of the realm is worth the price of a few dozen broken professional spirits. A well-placed source has suggested that the king views the buried report not as a missed opportunity for justice, but as a successfully contained contagion, a toxic asset that has been neutralized and placed where it can no longer infect the daily business of the crown. The surrounding atmosphere in the palace is one of a weary, watchful silence, a cold peace where everyone knows exactly where the bodies are buried, yet everyone has agreed, for the sake of the firm, to stop digging. For the members of the Sussex Survivors Club, however, the closing of this ledger is a wound that refuses to knit, a lingering bitterness that colors their perception of the very institution they once served with such fierce devotion. One can only imagine the internal monologue of a former aide, perhaps sitting in a quiet London cafe, watching the Duchess deliver yet another high-gloss speech on the power of empathy, while the official record of her own alleged cruelty gathers dust in a vault. There is a profound, soul-crushing irony in being told your lived experience is vital for the world to hear, unless, of course, that experience involves a member of the royal family behaving like a petulant Hollywood tyrant behind closed doors. A source behind closed doors has whispered that the sense of betrayal among the former staff is absolute, a feeling that they were used as pawns to build a defensive wall around the monarchy and were then unceremoniously abandoned once the wall was high enough. The long-term consequence of this institutional cowardice is a permanent thinning of the ranks of truly loyal old-school courtiers, replaced by a new breed of employee who understands that their loyalty is a one-way street and that the firm will sacrifice them in a heartbeat if the PR weather turns sour. As for the Duke and Duchess of Sussex, they remain in their sun-drenched exile, seemingly oblivious to the fact that their brand is now permanently underpinned by a documented, if hidden, history of workplace dysfunction. We must look with a certain degree of skepticism at the latest Archewell initiatives, knowing that the very same people preaching global harmony are allegedly incapable of maintaining a stable office environment for more than a few months at a time. The unexploded bomb in the royal vault remains their greatest liability, a silent witness to a character deficit that no amount of Netflix cinematography or ghost-written sentimentality can ever truly erase. Someone close to palace circles has noted that the Sussexes operate in a state of permanent defensive crouch, perpetually waiting for the other shoe to drop, their freedom from the monarchy bought at the cost of a lifetime of looking over their shoulders. It is a hollow victory, a life lived in the shadow of a secret that everyone knows, and it serves as a stark reminder that while you can indeed buy a platform, you cannot buy the respect of those who have seen you when the masks are off and the cameras are cold. The broader implications for the monarchy itself are perhaps the most troubling aspect of this entire affair, signaling a shift toward a more clinical corporate brand of sovereignty that values optics over the traditional bond of mutual protection between the sovereign and the servant. By choosing to bury the truth, the palace has inadvertently signaled that it no longer has the stomach for the kind of moral accountability that a modern public demands, opting instead for the safety of the shadows. The surrounding pressure to modernize has led to a situation where the firm acts more like a multinational legal firm than a family, a transformation that may save the crown in the short term, but risks hollowing out its soul in the long run. We are left with a monarchy that is functional, yes, and perhaps more stable than it was 5 years ago. But it is a monarchy that has lost a degree of its mystical authority, traded for the cold efficiency of a non-disclosure agreement and a locked filing cabinet. It is a cynical evolution for an institution that claims to represent the highest ideals of the British people, and it leaves a lingering question about what else might be hidden in those vaults in the name of confidentiality. In the final assessment, the story of the buried bullying report is not just a tale of a difficult duchess and her enabling husband. It is a story about the nature of power and the terrifying ease with which the truth can be disappeared when it becomes inconvenient. It serves as a sobering reminder that the fairy tale is often just a very expensive, very polished coat of paint applied over a structure that is frequently far more brutal than we care to admit. We have seen the human cost of royal ambition, the wreckage of careers, and the calculated silence of an institution that knows exactly how to protect itself at the expense of others. It is a narrative that leaves us with no heroes, only survivors and strategists, and a profound sense of what if regarding the justice that was promised but never delivered. The long-term legacy of this era will not be the speeches or the royal tours, but the quiet, unshakable knowledge that behind the velvet and the gold, there is a vault where the truth goes to die. We must reflect, then, on what it means to live in an age where the image of compassion is frequently used as a shield for its very opposite, and where the institutions we trust to uphold fairness are the ones most adept at subverting it. The Sussexes may have their mansion and their media deals, and the palace may have its silence and its stability, but the truth remains a stubborn, inconvenient thing that refuses to stay buried forever. It is my hope that by bringing these whispers into the light, we might find a path back to a version of the monarchy and a version of ourselves that values the dignity of the individual as much as the survival of the crown. Leave your thoughts below. I read every word you write, and I'm genuinely curious to see how you weigh the balance between institutional duty and human decency in this extraordinary case. And if you value this unvarnished, perhaps slightly cynical look at the mechanics of the monarchy, do ensure you are subscribed and share this with those who appreciate the truth, no matter how deeply it has been hidden. Until next time, I remain your humble correspondent in the corridors of power.